Veeam version 11 was GA in February 2021. One of the cornerstone features in Veeam version 11 was Veeam CDP, or continuous data protection, which offers tighter RTO and RTO points for replicas. It's built a little bit different than classic VMware replication in the fact that it's not built off the tap and to take VMware snapshots. It uses a VMware API for IO filtering, which is essentially gives us the ability to have a write splitter where we can capture a write as soon as it goes to a host and then write it to the second location. Before I go ahead and show you how to set this up inside ESX and then show you some issues that I ran into and how to fix them, let's go ahead and take a look at the architecture and how it works. Architecture looks pretty much like standard Veeam architecture. You got a Veeam server, you got proxies, just like regular replication. There are a couple different things in here. You'll notice the Veeam server now has a new service in it. The service is a CDP coordinator service. This is the service that oversees the whole process, right? It makes sure the proxies are available. It makes sure the IO filter is available. It's writing. It knows where to send the data. It knows if it's catching the data and writing it in. It's just like that. I need to say the traffic cop, but it oversees the process. One thing we have to do is we have to put a IO filter driver inside ESXi host. This is a VM. It's signed by ESX, so it can drop right in host. Nothing else you have to do inside ESX. It's responsible for just using that API for write splitting, right? It pulls the data as we need it, sends it to the CDP proxy. The CDP proxy has a cache on it, right? Some of it's memory cache, and then for anything that overflows memory can get written to disk. What that cache does is it holds these writes as they're getting transferred from the IO filter. It holds the writes, takes the writes, processes them up, compresses them, sends them to the secondary CDP, which is basically the target CDP proxy. This proxy captures the data just like our regular replication proxy does, and then it passes it to the IO filter that is sitting at the target side. The target side IO filter captures the data and writes the data inside to the data stores. It either writes data as vmdk, or depending if it's incremental writes that are coming in, every minute or so, every second, depending on however you have your CDP policy set. It's writing these the writes of the changes are captured into T logs, and those are used to actually replay the VM. Anything older than a day is actually a delta file. It's really a snapshot, but you can't call it delta snapshot, because it's written by the IO filter, right? It's not written by ESX, so it's really can't call it a snapshot. It's a delta file. A couple things to know of is, one of the things that's a main requirement for this, and it's always usually an issue, is the DNS. DNS has to be set up properly in order for this whole thing to work, right? And when I say properly, that means, all your Veeam components have to have a record, and they have to have a reverse DNS record or a PTR record, pointer record, right? All your ESX components have to have a pointer record and a record. So, you're looking at your ESXi host, your vCenter or your VCSA server, all has to have all that stuff. And they have to be resolvable between each other, right? So, the Veeam server should be able to resolve all its components by ping by IP or ping by DNS name. And it should be able to pull up all the FQN names of everything involved in this, not only the proxies, but also the hosts and the VCSA. Be able to pull up an FQDN from an NS lookup, right? That absolutely has to be done for all these components. So it's the Veeam components and all the ESXi vSphere components. If you go look on the forums for any errors or issues that we're having setting up CDP, Anton will be the first one to say in his post is it's always DNS. 99.9% of the time, the problem is DNS. I had a problem in my lab setting this up, and it was caused by some bad decisions I made when I was setting up my lab DNS-wise 5-6 years ago that I never fixed, and I actually was forced to have to go back and fix them. Once I fixed them, everything worked properly. So let's go ahead and take a look at the host and see how to set this up. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to go install the IO filter. So the IO filter is pretty straightforward. You go into your ESXi host and you go to your cluster. You can go ahead and say, if this wasn't installed, it would tell me to install the IO filter, but I have it installed, so it's going to stay install the IO filter. The easiest way is if you just go to your vCenter server, you right-click on your vCenter server, you go to Manage IO Filters. This will go ahead and do a quick scan of your environment. It'll look and see if you have any IO filters installed. So it'll ask you, it'll say, scanning for IO filters. It didn't see any IO filters, so it's going to ask you where your clusters are. You go ahead and put all that in here, what you wanted to set up. Right. Once you have all that done, you just go ahead and click apply. It goes ahead and tries to send up everything. It runs a little job window, just like you see for backup job with the action log. It tells you how it's working, and if there's any errors that it throws up, it'll throw up errors. Right. So let me go ahead and talk about one of the errors that I got, because I got actually 2 errors from this, and that pointed me to having to go fix my DNS environment. I should have known better, but I started without looking at DNS. So the first error I got was this installing the CDP error cluster, right? It's not allowed in current state. Then I also got another error that said it failed to install the IO filters, right? Failed to install IO filters on the cluster, right? So, if you go search this, you'll find it in the forums, and then, Anton will say, you got to go fix your DNS, and somebody comes back and argues and says, no, it can't be DNS, and he says, it's always DNS, go check DNS. I went and checked DNS, and I had all kinds of issues. I had, my hosts were in there without any FQDNs. Thankfully, everything had an A record, proper A record, and everything had a reverse DNS or PTR record, right? Thank God for that. But some of them weren't set up properly with FQDN, so I had to get that fixed. So after I fixed the DNS stuff and cleaned out some old DNS errors, I went back in and tried to reinstall the IO filter again. And then I got the second error, right? This one here says, oh, okay. So, and this happened for 2 of the 3 hosts. So it was telling me, unable to access the offline agent bundle. So my first thought was, okay, I need to look and see if this bundle's available. But then I thought, well, wait a second, maybe it still is DNS. So I decided, okay, I can resolve all my hosts, ESXi hosts. I can resolve all my Veeam components from my Windows server. So as long as I can resolve them from one, I should be able to resolve them from everything. Probably what I need to do is go make sure I have the DNS settings set up proper, because, my hosts were pretty old and I probably didn't set them up properly. So I went into the DCUI of the host, and then I noticed in one of my hosts, I didn't have the proper domain controller, right? So I have a domain DNS controller in my lab. And then I have, the DNS router, which is my regular Wi-Fi router, in the house. I didn't have the IP address to my domain DNS, and obviously domain DNS isn't set up in my Arrow, right? So I had to fix that, and then I looked at another one, and on the other one I actually had an DNS IP address that it picked up from one of my old ISPs that I no longer use anymore. So once we got past that, everything installed, worked out properly, all's good, and we're good to go, right? So once I got past that and everything installed properly, and I'll show you where you'll see that error at here in just a second. Next thing you need to do is, we need the proxies. So if you notice here, you go to proxies, we're going to install a proxy. You just go in here and install a CDP proxy, right? You see there's 2 CDP proxies. I have 2 set up because I want to simulate using a host, and I want to simulate using not a host, a source and a target proxy, right? So let's go ahead and just step through one of these. So if you go step through the properties, it's just like setting up a regular proxy, right? You got to choose the server you want to drop the service on. You get that. The cache is what I talked about earlier, is the section that holds all the rights that are pertinent to your CDP policy, right? So I picked a drive. The recommendation is 10 gigs per VMDK that you're going to be replicating, right? So if you have 500 VMDKs, it's 10 gigs, 500. That's 5,000, which is basically 5 terabytes. 50 VMs is 500 gigs. I'm only doing 1 VM, 1 proxy. It should be 10 gigs, but I went ahead and set this to 50. The user guide actually recommends 50. And then if you have more than 5, obviously you're going to need more than 50. And then you may need to make this a little bit bigger depending on how tight you want your RPOs, right? Everything goes written to disk, and when everything's written in memory. When memory fills up, it writes to the disk. You step next to here, and then you go to the traffic rules, right? So you write your traffic rules. You get all that done, right? Review, apply, finish, just like you do everything else. And pretty soon, voila, you have your nice new proxies. Once you get the proxies, then you just have to go create the job. So in order to create the jobs, you just go here to the jobs, right click on and go to CDP policy. I'm going to go ahead and just edit a policy that I already have, and then we'll talk about how all this works, right? So we're used to seeing the scene with a classic replication, right? You got your replica seeding, you got your network mapping, and you got your ability to re-IP your virtual machines, right? So we have all that stuff in here. You set that how you need it. You go add your virtual machines. You add your virtual machines just like you typically do for any other jobs, tags, data stores, host, folders and clusters, all that kind of stuff. You add it in there, pick your proc, add them in. Then you select your destination. We've seen this before, right? You have your host and clusters, you have your resource pools, your VM folders, and your data stores. You go ahead and select what data store everything is going to be written to, just like we normally have with our classic replication. Go to policy settings, pick your source proxies and your target proxies if you need to, depending on how everything's laid out. And then you can go ahead and test if you have enough horsepower to handle your current CDP load activity. So we'll see if your proxies are big enough or not, and if you have enough bandwidth, right? So it looks like I have everything okay. I have higher than 14 megabits per second inside my lab, so we're good. It has everything set up here is what I need. I think I meet all these requirements. So we're done. That's based on the past day. It's a start to get you, to get you going. Okay, on your advanced settings, if you need to set SNMP traps, right, or emails, we can get that. Here we have the schedule. The schedule actually takes care of two things. We have a recovery point, or the short-term objective, and then we also have the long-term objective. So recovery point is the amount of time that you want to restore back to, right? What point in time do you want to restore back to? We could do minutes, and we could do seconds, with 60 seconds being the highest you can go, or 60 minutes. You can schedule when this happens, if it's permitted all the time during the day, or for some reason you need to pause CDP because you got a production outage or something, or it's taking too much bandwidth, you just need to pause it at certain times of the day. On top of that, we have the ability to go ahead and have short-term retention, which is nothing more than how many of these 1 minute recovery point objectives I want to keep. So in my case, I want to keep 5. So think of this as the amount of 1 minute restore points I want to have to fail back to in case the first one at 1 minute is not good. 2 minute may be good, 3 minute may be good, 4 minute may be good, 5 minute. But after 5 minutes, I don't want it. Don't do that anymore, right? So that's how many of those we keep. For long-term retention is more or less we need to have an extra point that we want to keep for longer, just in case things go bad. Also, that point needs to be quiesced. So if we need to do any kind of application image word processing, this is where Veeam can do that here. So if you go to the schedule, you can see they have a schedule for you can create these extra long-term points for application consistent or crash consistent RTO points if you need to. So you can go ahead and select that and make those only crash consistent during that time, application consistent the rest of the time. I'm just going to make everything application consistent. Also, we have a standard offset, right? So if you wanted to start at 15 minutes of the hour, 30 minutes of the hour instead of zero time on the hour, that'll happen. Think of a long-term retention point as, okay, 5 minutes is great. What happens if 5 minutes is bad? Then if something really goes wrong, I want to go back to an hour, a couple hours, right? I want to go back to 2 days, 3 days, 4 hours, right? 1 day, 2 hours, 3 hours, an hour, right? Just to restore back to that if I have to. And those points have to be application quiesced, whereas, this obviously with CDP and a low tight RPO, you can't stop the data to get a quiescence as you're replicating, right? So that's what long-term retention does and these, remember, are actually delta disks, right? They're the data set and written in, and the delta disk is created by the IO filter, and the VMware API for IO filtering creates those delta disks, and they leave them there, and then you fail back to a delta disk. So you have two things. You got short term for the short RPO, and then if you need to fail back to a quiet copy, we have that long term. And then of course here you can keep how many of these you need to keep. The next thing to think about is guest processing. So when we talk about guest processing here, just remember we're not talking about the short term, right? Because we can't quiesce the real short term. Like, you got a minute, you want a minute, 30-second RPO. You can't pause that for a second while you capture that data because the pause process takes longer than that, right? So, and you'd have to keep that snapshot open all the time and take up too much data. It's just not feasible to do that. So the guest processing can be used to keep application consistent long-term retention points, things longer than an hour, 1 hour to a day, right? I want to keep, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour, 4 hours. Every 4 hours, I want a quiesced point in time that I'm going to keep for all day, right? Or I'm going to keep for 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. Those are snapshots. And that's what this setting here sets, right? This is typical application image word processing. You go ahead and enable your application image word processing. You come in here and you select the applications that you want. For this VM, I have a SQL on there, SQL Express. I want to go ahead and set what I want to do with that. Okay, I need to have successful processing done, right? For this to go. If it fails, just don't keep the long-term point because it has to be application consistent. Or, you know what? Try to do the application consistency. I know there may be errors, but I still want the recover point anyway. Even though it's not application consistent, I'll deal with it. And then what do you want to do about logs? Do a copy only. Because this may be SQL Express in simple recovery mode, that's all we can do is copy only. Or if I'm doing full recovery and I want to do, I want to handle Veeam to handle the log truncation, and also we're doing backup from transaction logs, right? We can do that. Veeam has the ability to go ahead and truncate logs if need be, right? So we can do that here. And then also the ability to use a persistent guest agent or a non-persistent guest agent, right? So go ahead and select your copies, all this stuff. Once you have it selected, you're good. And then move on to the summary, click finish, and you're done. For more information, always remember, please consult the Veeam user guide that can be found at helpcenter.veeam.com.